to cover a number of the events, a number of the aspects of power in our first segment. And so today and in our future segments, we are going to break down each aspect so that we can make a deeper dive into power and access and what African women must do to better organize ourselves to occupy the space of power and resolve our contradictions as African women and as African people. We're joined here with Sister Zandiswa Kula of the Pan-African Women's Organization, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. We are joined here with Sister Dr. Chinzira Kahina of Per-Ankh and the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union, and Sister Njiba Friwat of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union. And these are our speakers for today. We were hoping to have Sister Mahau, but she may not be able to join us with the PAC. But in any case, we're going to move forward. We're going to wish Sister Mahau and her family well and hope all turns out well. And we want to also welcome you all and also remind you that this is African Liberation Month. And so we will be hosting and also sharing a number of All-African People's Revolutionary Party African Liberation Day events, as well as if you go to our APRP Facebook page, you'll see ALD events that are being held by other Pan-Africanist organizations around the world. But we want to remind you that we have a two-day event on May 24th and May 25th around African Liberation Day. And if you go to our APRP Facebook page, you will get more details on participating in those events and viewing those events. So let us remember that we are in African Liberation Day month, and we want to encourage all of you to support our ALD events all around the world. And as we always say, if you're not in an organization, so that we continue this African liberation work, join an organization working for the liberation and organization of your people. So I will present briefly what is power? How do we define power? And then we will ask Sister Njiba to talk about the political and ideological spaces of power. Sister Zandiswa will talk about the security of our bodies as power. And then Dr. Chinzira Kahina will talk about the intellectual and artistic and philosophical activism that is contained within power in our movements. So to talk about what is power, I wanted to just define power so that we can understand what it is we're actually talking about. And so some of the aspects of defining it is the ability to control or influence the behavior of a people or influence the outcome of events. Political power enables the people to control the policies, the functions, and the culture of the society. The sources of power are the force, the influence, and the authority of the people. Synonyms used when defining power is authority, dominion, jurisdiction, command, the right to govern and command, the rule or control. All of this implies influence over the people. All power is inherent in the people. Let me repeat, all power is inherent in the people. The people have the authority. And so authority is allowed by those who are being governed. Authority is derived by the political legitimacy that we give to those who govern us. Power is the ability to accomplish the goal. To have power is to be able to accomplish the goal. Power is the authority to make decisions and the legitimacy to make those decisions and exercise those decisions. So here is our reason to be, our raison d'etre as women. We are human beings who have the dominion over our bodies, our minds, our reproductive capacity or abilities, if we have them, their role in society, with family, culture, and the environment. When we give our authority to a man to determine each of our responsibilities and abilities, we give away our voice, our thoughts, our being to determine any and everything about our existence as human beings. Our power lies in the recognition of the existence, our conscious and unconscious role in life as human beings, and our responsibility as human beings to determine the role and responsibility we have for our own existence. Existence as a human being, reproductive and intellectual capacity that produces the egg and the ovum, that produces offspring, the intuitive abilities, our physical and psychological traits as human beings, the differences in our abilities, both physical, psychological, social, from males, our conscious and unconscious capabilities, our societal expectations and responsibilities. These are the things that we have as women and that we give away when we do not control and occupy the spaces of power. Power is reflected in every aspect of our society. And women, just like all gender, make those decisions to play the part in the development and execution of those aspects that provide security for ourselves and the decisions that are made in executing the role of power. For clarification, we are saying that we must occupy all spaces of power, that our security is in our occupying those spaces. So that is my definition. So to go further, we want to welcome Sister Njiba Friawat to talk about the political and ideological spaces of power.
Thank you so much, Sister Mzuri, Auntie Mzuri, Mzuri of all knowing things, for that introduction. And it falls directly into my conversation or my thoughts about power, right? Because I want to talk about the political and ideological spaces of power. And when I think about the political and ideological spaces of power, I think I must first understand what is ideology. And for me, ideology is a set of ideas, principles, and values that guide our life, right? That dictates our relationship to the masses, that dictates our relationship to ourselves, that also dictates our relationship to the state, and also that dictates our relationship to revolution. And so when I'm thinking about ideology and the politics of power and ideology, I'm reminded that African women, unfortunately, are oftentimes guided by an ideology that is anti-African and anti-women. Of course, this ideology we're talking about is tied to the capitalist system. This ideology ultimately is part and parcel of the repression and oppression of African women globally and inside of the African world. And it's important for us to recognize that in one, embracing, understanding, and taking power over their ideology ultimately is the first step towards freeing themselves from repression and oppression. It's important as African women that we must discover and reorientate our ideology, right? Because as a form of power, ideology can transform the way that we view ourselves in relationship to society. A transformed ideology, a liberated and transformative ideology will enhance the way that we engage with repressive acts against African women. It will help us organize collectively against the triple oppression that African women have to face. And more importantly, it will give us confidence, the confidence that we need to organize and push back. And as we say now, participate in what many people are calling self-care, but I would call it revolutionary care. The care that we are looking at our minds, looking at our consciousness, and looking at our ideology as a priority. And those three key components of our existence must be controlled by African women. It's important to note that once we begin to adopt a new ideological framing, one which is egalitarian, one which adopts humanist principles, we can then begin to see that ideology does not have to be anti-woman. The ideology currently is anti-woman that we're operating under, many of us, and it's anti-African woman. So I think it's particularly important for us to take note of those things. We also are in need of a cultural revolution. I know we're talking about African women, but I love Sekou Touré's text, Revolution, Culture, and Pan-Africanism, where he talks about the need for a cultural revolution. I would suggest we need a cultural revolution and an ideological revolution inside the African world. This cultural revolution is something that will help African women undergo this transformation of how we view ourselves in relationship to our ideology, how we view our role in the Pan-African and revolutionary movement. Because part of the challenge of not having power over your ideology is that you view yourselves the way others decide to view you, or the way society dictates you are. Your role in society is often dictated by the ideology of society, but you reinforce your role in society because you also embrace and propagate the ideology, which is also part oppressing you. I think it's also important to note, as Sekou Touré also mentioned in Revolutionary Culture and Pan-Africanism, he talked about universalism, right? Ideology is not universal. Oftentimes we think that just saying we have a revolutionary ideology will address everybody's contradictions, and it won't, because it's not universal. African women have particular contradictions. African women should have the ability and right to identify and practice an ideology which works for the conditions in which they're in. And this is something that is perhaps contrary to the dogma that there's only one ideology. I believe that there's power in ideology. There's power in women embracing ideology, but that also means that that ideology may not look the same across space, time, and place. Of course, it needs to be revolutionary or have some humanist egalitarian principles, right? But just like we say scientific socialism is based on scientific principles, we recognize that ideology is also based on scientific principles. It's not something that you just find somewhere floating in the sky. There's science to ideology. And once we recognize that women must take control of their ideology from a scientific perspective, right, we then can see how women should have agency in order to dictate their ideology. I think it's also important to note that, of course, I mentioned before, but I think it really needs to be said that we need a liberatory and emancipatory ideology, right? We need to have liberated zones, as Kwame Nkrumah says in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, in our ideological spaces. Some of our ideologies are not liberated zones. They're contested zones. Some of the ideology in which we're operated with our enemy-held zones. We need liberated zones ideologically. And then, of course, two quick things that I think are important is that, because my time is up, 24 seconds, is that ideology is inherently political, right? And one must understand the political nature of ideology. And once we realize the political nature of ideology, we'll begin to transform our ideological framing. And then lastly, I think that once we begin, the moment that we decide that we need to transform our ideology, that is the moment in which we will reclaim our power of space and place. We have the power to transform our political and ideological space and place of power. Forward ever, backwards never.
Thank you, Sister Njiba. And I had some comments, but I'll save them for the end and some questions. But I want to also emphasize, let's make sure that our conversation and our points can be relatable, perhaps give some examples so that we can really dive in and encourage our community that's watching to also be able to not only understand, but also ask questions that are being, sort of bounced around from our conversation. But yes, you raised some very, very good points there. And I'm hoping that we can go into some of those a little later. For now, I want to introduce Sister Zandiswa Kula of the Pan-African Congress of Azania, the Pan-African Women's Organization. Zandiswa, and she's going to talk about the security of our bodies occupying that space of power. Welcome, Sister Zandiswa.
Thank you so much, Sister Mzuri. Greetings to all of the sisters that are tuned in, and greetings to basically everyone that is watching with us today. So I understand my theme basically to be the security of the bodies, right? Or our bodies as women, and also the negation of that in relation to the space of power. I think I have connection problems. Oh, sorry for that, it just minimized. Okay, so as I start my conversation, right, I would really like to reflect on the life of a sister called Nomhle, right, or Namhla Mtwa, a lady who has recently been killed, right, by her male partner, who she was obviously in relation with. And I want to begin it at this particular level because this is a thing that we face, for example, in our context on a daily basis, where there are constant reports on the victimization of women and the violation of women's bodies to a place where lives are taken, right? We have been dealing with this for the longest of times since 2016, leading to today, where a month does not end without a female body on the line, right? Meaning that women being killed or raped. And I always see that, or I look at that in relation to the reflection of our society, right? And also the social schema of women. So when you negate women as social beings, right? Or you negate the ability of women being able to be reasoning people, right? And also social beings, and how that becomes a limitation in relation to the quest of self-determination, but also their humanity as human beings who are living, that need to be accorded the respect, right? And also the fact that they are humans. And what happens is that in most cases, because we live in a patriarchal society, what happens in relation to women's bodies is that it is negated in relation to your political setup, your economic setup, your social setup as well, right? And you find that women simply just become mere components within our society and all other factors or sectors of society. And they're not people who determine the dynamics of the space in relation to their existence as human beings, right? Who ought to be validated within the spaces in which they exist. So, for example, when we deal with the question of revolution and socialism, for example, in our context, we begin by grounding it by saying that revolution is a tool, right, to help answer the question or the strife in relation to how shall mankind be able to live, but also determine, right, the nature of human existence, the environment, and also the dynamics, in actual fact, that govern the order of the space. So what you find in that is that the place or the significance of women is it's either it is undermined or it is non-existent, right? The political space on its own, in actual fact, has become a sexualized space rather than being a space where you identify human beings for the contribution that they are making in relation to changing society and the lives of people. But what happens is that, right, we merely just want to be interested in the sexualizing of the bodies of women. And we also use that as an object, in actual fact, which is a reflection of the power dynamics of the space that does not, in actual fact, it does not in any way free women from the strifes that they are living in, nor is it able, for example, to give us tools to be able to answer to the questions that we face on a daily basis. So, for example, if you look at the October Revolution, right, and then the Communist Party in Russia, right, what happens is that, in actual fact, the party there was unable or it neglected the voice of women at the level of people who are living in the street, who have been able, in a tangible reality, dealt with the strifes of the power dynamics within society. And that happens within our societies as well, right? In relation to the question of bread, right? And how are we going to be able to feed ourselves and our households, but also the very same a need for us to be able to be recognized as human beings within the space. What happens is that many, or in most cases, we are sidelined from being part of the pivotal components of factors that want to deal with the questions of human existence. And many people simply just think that the problems of women are merely just problems of women. So even, for example, when you're dealing with the question of reproduction, right? When you're talking about how do women further to be able, like, how do they own their bodies in relation to reproduction, right? When you're talking about giving birth, and also when you're talking about the economy, and also the fact that we are workers as well within society. And also we are people that belong in a community, meaning that we also deal with the social strifes, right? Or the dynamics of social existence. So what happens there is that our problems in relation to the national problem or the problems of humanity holistically, they simply just become a bystander or an addition of some sort. And they are not, in actual fact, integrated into the pivotal problems of society. So, for example, the fact or the appalling fact that women are dying at the hands of men in our context, who are raping them, who are violating their bodies, it simply just becomes a mere problem of women, right? It doesn't become a national problem or a heightened a problem of caution in relation to human existence, right? The whole idea that if one group, right, or if one people, for example, they are restricted from being able to extend or even be able to live in relation to their rights, right? What happens is that we do not deal with the issue of injustice, right, or the issue of social justice. So in relation to the bodies of women, the problem is that the society that we live in on its own, in actual fact, it doesn't recognize the human status of women. And as a result, when you look at the political, the economic, and the social, we are merely disregarded on the basis of that. And once we are able, for example, to deal with the struggle within the struggle and incorporate within our struggle the demands, right, and the call and also the dynamics of the human existence of women, then we are able to even I don't know how you would call it, but to transform, I think that's the better word, to transform even the nature and the outlook or the orientation of our very struggle. Hence, we say that we are dealing with the question of a struggle within a struggle, where we are struggling for a socialist existence, but also at the very same time, we are struggling within the very same contradictions that we exist within as women that are trying by all means to limit our human existence on the question of self-determination, self-governance, but also self-ownership, right? So I just want to say that nothing changes. We merely just become people that speak from our different corners in relation to the fate of women and the bodies of women and the victimization or exploitation or oppression of women. And that's where it ends, right? We create laws, but in actual fact, the legal system on its own, in our context, for example, is a reflection of a colonialist capitalist system, right? And we know that in actual fact, so long as capitalism continues to exist, it changes or it very much restricts the ability of women to being able, for example, to self-determine, but also to be beings that are able to own themselves for their own program.
Thank you, Sister Zandiswa. Excellent points. And I think we can get into it, but what it really, to me, said, in a sense, is that I look at the problem, especially when we talk about the violence and the insecurity of ourselves, is a reflection of the violence and insecurity of the entire society, of humanity. And then I started thinking about the pandemic or the plandemic, because how do we get the attention of everyone? Because we are being violated by our own brothers, by other, other members of the society, and that we have to see this as something that is a pandemic, that we have to get the attention of all to look at the issue of the devaluation of the entire society of humanity, and especially for us as women, as beings in this society, who are the majority. But to get the attention to do this, we must occupy these spaces of power. We must take, as Sister Mahal says, unapologetically, we must take these spaces of power to get the attention of the society, of the importance of us as human beings, as all of us as human beings, and begin to break down the political, philosophical, ideological, and physical violations that go on in our society. So I think this was a perfect example of what, as you say, daily, every few minutes, a girl or a woman is violated or abused and even killed. And in addition, those that are not being fed, those that aren't being housed, clothed, provided medical care, and the basic securities of humanity that are needed. And so we have to occupy as the majority. So thank you for your presentation and that example in particular. Now, and we'll be able to ask questions and to go further into these aspects, but we want to bring in Sister Chinzira Kahina to talk about the activism, the artistic, intellectual, and otherwise organizational aspects that we are dealing with when we're dealing with occupying our spaces of power. Dr. Chin.
Greetings, Hotep, everyone. It's always an honor and privilege to be amongst my sistren who speak unapologetically, firmly, and with some facts. So I'm giving thanks for just being part of this panel. I'd like to really start with a particular quote that gives some other elements of engagement when we are speaking about our women folk, when we're speaking about African women must lead, and specifically around this space and place of power. Many times when we start to have these types of versations, it is taken really out of context because some persons actually feel that we are saying the same thing as a Eurasian feminist, anti-male, anti-masculine vibration. And that is not the context in which we're coming. And it's very important that how we start this versation, how we engage in our reasoning, that's fully understood, right? Because many times it's just not always seen in that light. And that's one of the reasons that we are even having to have these types of discussions amongst ourselves, amongst one another, around these areas of power. Many times when we begin to talk about some of these conversations, it is also seen as not as important, just as our sister Nana Mzuri shared, that it's sidelined, as our sister Sandiswa shared, that we overlook the intellectual ramifications of this work, as was shared by Sister Dr. Njiba. And so I just desired, before we got to the nitty gritty part of the Q&A, and this is a quote from Suzanne Césaire, and this is translated from French, and people that are not familiar with Suzanne Césaire, she was the force surrounding the work of Aimé Césaire. Many people remember Aimé Césaire. And because of the work that his wife brought forth, and I'm going to share this, why in the past have we been so unconcerned about expressing our ancestral anxiety in a direct manner? The urgency of this cultural problem escapes only those who are determined to put their hands over their eyes so as not to be disturbed from an artificial peace, and at any cost, even the price of stupidity and death. And I share this primarily, and this is shared in her work, The Great Camouflage, from 1942, just so that we get some context of an African woman bringing this voice of strength and directness forward in the 1940s, at a time while France was doing everything in its power to decimate the existence of free-thinking Africans in spaces like Martinique, Haiti, Guadeloupe, and everywhere that the French went. Yes. And I shared that because when we talk about this intellectual engagement, it's always linked inside of the philosophical one. When I'm speaking of the intellectual spaces here of power, I'm not just limiting it to the academic space, right? I'm speaking more towards how the overall reasoning, our ability to understand things objectively, the way that we are able to speak of things in an abstract, but then just as has been suggested, that we can also bring it into a very practical, grassroots, people-centered, human-centered space, and how we engage and deal with these exchanges. When I'm speaking of philosophical, I'm also speaking of it in the context of making sure that at the grounding, since we're saying African women must lead, that the grounding is around a very African, and I'll go deeper, ancestral spacing of how we deal with power. It's almost as if we're going to be moving in a direction that, especially moving beyond 2022, where even those very 20th century handles and definitions of the matriarchy, the patriarchy, matrilineage, and patrilineage have to be shifted, because it has to be about equity. It has to be about balance. It needs to be about restoring harmony, so that all of these horrific forms of terror that are intentionally and institutionally designed to dismantle how women are in these spaces of power and how we engage in these spaces of power are done when it comes to our intellectual engagement, our philosophical engagement. And in regards to the philosophical piece, we're talking about how we deal with those fundamentals of knowledge. Are they really fundamental, or are they twisted and contorted against the interests of women who authentically hold up half of the sky, right? The piece around the cultural creatives integration, and again, this could easily have been a much longer discourse. And I'm just giving some very cogent points around how we look at intellectualism in the context of women, African women in particular, leading and being able to be in those grounded spaces and being respected when we come into these intellectual spaces of engagement, and not just seen as sidebars or at the end of the program, or that they have all these backroom decisions that are done in the forefront by many of the men involved in these different revolutionary activities, or even in the counter-revolutionary ones, because that even in the counter-revolutionary activities, women are still sidelined. So in the revolutionary spaces, when we speak of African women lead, African women must lead, because that's going to restore the balance. That's going to restore the harmony. It is never in the form or the context of exclusionism in regards to our brothers, and especially our brothers that respect, honor, protect, and provide stability and form for how we engage in these intellectual spaces, as well as how we engage in these philosophical spaces. With the philosophical space, however, many people take knowledge like, as long as the Eurasians say it, it's valuable, it's rationalized, it's true. And we have to add that air of development and engagement, so that when we are involved in these discourses, that our philosophical framing, our philosophical references are grounded in African, ancestral, original, sovereign, with us having power at the base. Then we can actually move forward without trying to utilize these Eurasian models that were not designed to institutionalize, strengthen, uplift anything for African people in general, much less for our women. The part about the cultural creatives, and a lot of times when we use that term cultural creatives and creative arts, what we've seen in this region, and I'm speaking from a space of being in St. Croix, Virgin Islands, and I'm speaking wider because in the Caribbean, we have been able to strengthen partnerships with our Pan-African brothers and sisters, whether it's through the Caribbean Pan-African Network, whether it's through a variety of the works that the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union has been in the forefront of for years. I'll make sure I say this correctly, for decades. And irrespective of the limitations that have come forth, and the many organizations that I have had the honor and privilege of organizing in, this issue of intellectual, philosophical, cultural, creative integration of African women always comes to a space where we almost have to go like into battle. We have to like get, bring our armor in order to be able to be in these spaces. And that is not acceptable. It is not to be tolerated. It will not be tolerated moving forward, only because, as we said in our theme, African women must lead. And either you flow in that vibrational shift and accept that form of transformative engagement, or there's other things that you can do, but do not serve as an obstacle because it interferes with all of the different areas that each of my comrade sisters are sharing around this particular theme. As I'm closing, because I believe I'm at like on my minute point, and I share these things around that whole vibration of political dysfunctionalism, intellectual dysfunctionalism, the imbalance that happens even when we go into these creative art spaces. And we can go to, I'll use reggae as an example. You go to a reggae function and you're going to see a whole lineup of the brethren them. And you might see some sisters singing in the background on the side. However, we have to begin to move that vibrational shift forward, so that even our female artists, our women artists that are speaking truth to power in their music, in their arts, in their theatrical engagements, in their films, that we put that forward and put it forward in a very progressive, very revolutionary, and like I started, an unapologetic, firm space, so that when we speak of that African fundamentalism, when we speak of Pan-Africanist values that are grounded around the total liberation and unification of Africa with social governance that is about Africa, about African balance, about African women being held up and supported and not terrorized inside of our African nation, then all of these philosophical, intellectual cultural creative activities will reflect that. And that was part of the piece that I'm always referring to as the ma'atical balance. And when I say this is something that has been shared through the works of many, 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 many sisters and brothers that were kind enough to let me work under their tutelage. And whether it was a head of state in the African continent, whether it was a leader inside of the various organizations that I've been participatory in, and also being able to ground that on no longer having that vibration of cowardice amongst how we express ourselves and being able to engage with one another. And I believe I'm at my point of time. Please confer for me, Nana Mzuri.
I'm sorry, I wasn't keeping time. I was listening. I didn't know when we started.
No,
I'm sorry.
I have 30 seconds according to my timer, but I'll just close with this. Part of that vibrational engagement, when we speak of the spaces of power and place for African women, and for African women to accept that African women must lead in the intellectual spaces, in the philosophical spaces, in these cultural creative spaces, is for us to be not only present, but to be present, to be prepared, and to bring that socio-spiritual vibration. It's another layer of an African martial arts form, if you will, for us to be able to come not only to defend, not only to protect, but to sustain and maintain truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony. Those ancestral feminine principles of Ma'at in all of our interactions and all that we're doing. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and some questions that will come. Give thanks, Hotep.
Inkosi Asante Sana Madasi. Shukran. Thank you. And thank you all presenters. And before we open it up to the audience, I wanted to ask a few questions in terms of some of the comments that were made for all of the presenters. I think one of the things that was said, Sister Njiba, you talked about the ideological interpretation of ourselves and how we view ourselves and how we are viewed. And when we look at the numbers, because if you look at least on the continent of Africa, almost every state, and I will say every state, and we call them nation states because we see this as the United African States. And that is the goal that we're moving forward to, is a united Africa, that every nation state has a majority of women, and yet patriarchy continues to dominate. And even though in some territories we have been able to expel the colonialists, we still have neo-colonial elements within the society. How is it that we're still ideologically interpreting or being interpreted as less than 100% and not engaging in 100% or at least 50% or 51% or at least 30 or 40% of these spaces of power, if in fact we have expelled the colonialists who was seen as the enemy? How is it that we as women haven't occupied these spaces? And what can we do to occupy these spaces? Because we ourselves are part and parcel of the process, the power, the interpretation. It's not just them, it's us. So just, Njiba and whoever else wants to talk about, how is it that we, as the majority in these nation states, aren't occupying these spaces, and how are we interpreting ourselves, and how do we break that mold so that we can, because we want to expand this into a campaign that is global, but especially for African women worldwide and on the continent. How do we occupy those spaces?
thank you very much for that question and the opportunity to drill down on my presentation if it was a bit too abstract. So I think this is a very excellent question, right? When we think about nation states on the continent, we see that over 51%, as you mentioned, of the population are generally women. They're young women, right? And the challenge that we currently have is that because ideology is tied to economic systems, and the ruling elite, or basically the people who rule the country, often dictate the economic system, or in Africa's case, fall in line with the economic system. Because I don't know if any African elite are dictating the economic system, right? What tends to happen is our ideology comes through our formal and informal education. So like it comes through primary school, JHS, SHS. It even comes through our TVs, like it comes through our Nollywood videos. It comes through our telenovelas, which are not African, by the way, but they're dubbed in Tree or Ewe or House or whatever. The role of women comes through our engagement with our elder sisters and with folks in our community, right? And even through our culture, right? And so what tends to happen is one's ideology gets both constructed and reinforced through these different sectors of society. And the ideology that dictates that women are not capable of leading, women's role is in the domestic space and not in the private space, right? Not in the public space, or not in private, or not outside of the household. Women's, primary role is, reproduction, right, and production of the household. That trickles down, and it dictates the way that we view ourselves, and it also dictates the way in which how far we believe we can go, right? And oftentimes it dictates where we have women who have been leaders of countries. Sirleaf Johnson, right, out of Liberia. She was the president of Liberia, but it didn't necessarily change the conditions of African women, because as a president of Nigeria, it didn't mean that she was operating using an African woman's ideological framing. She was operating using a capitalist ideology, which continued to promote patriarchy. So, and what tends to happen is these women who rise to the leadership, they're the exceptions. Njiba, she just worked really hard. Or, Mzuri, she was able to balance everything. So therefore she's a president and a mother and a grandmother, and she still cooks, she still pounds fufu for her household, right? So these women who rise to leadership roles, they're exceptions. And the majority of women in spaces where patriarchy is rampant, they cannot break through that ceiling, right? And so what I think what we need to do is begin to have conversations in multiple languages about how we view ourselves, about how we construct our ideas, about what we think power is. Because the thing about ideology is it's not like something out in the sky. Like we develop our ideology in our own environment, and we have elements of a liberatory ideology everywhere around us. But because the ideology, capitalist ideology, is so dominant, that alternative ideologies often get smashed. And I'll give you an example. And then I'll stop. If you are in Ghana or Nigeria or across the continent or wherever, because now it's everywhere. Like if you watch the majority of Ghanaian soap operas, some Nollywood soap operas are pushing back against the violence against women, right? But if you just turn on a TV and you're a young woman, or you're a young teen, or you're older women, or even men, and you watch them, and you see a situation where, actually, let me give you an example. One time I was on a bus to Takrady, right? And there was about 50 people on the bus. And the video on the bus was about, the film was about a woman and a man who were dating. And the man was participating in domestic violence against women, was beating the woman. And the woman, and we were all into the video, and there was a pushback. You shouldn't be doing violence against your wife. This is unacceptable, blah, 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 X, Y, and Z. Not one person told the woman to leave the marriage, right? The purpose of the whole video was that if you're patient with your husband, your relationship will be rosy at the end, right? And he'll stop beating you. And all you have to do is be the dutiful, submissive wife, right? This is like the cap of all Hollywood, Nollywood, and Gollywood movies, right? And even movies that come out of India that are dubbed in Chi. And so if you're watching this every single day of your existence, and you believe that your role as a woman is a wife and a mother, and culturally, unfortunately, in some spaces, not all, but in some spaces, if you're not a wife and mother, your humanity ceases, right, to exist, right? In some spaces, you can't become an ancestor if you don't have children, right? So all of these things dictate how we view ourselves ideologically. Because who wants to be an ancestor? Who wants to not be an ancestor because they don't have children? Who wants to not be viewed as human because they're not a wife or children, right? Who doesn't want to be viewed with respect? Because the primary way that women get respect in some spaces in patriarchal worlds is through domestic spaces. And so I think thinking about changing the way we think about ourselves in relationship to development, and also looking around us to see how we can, because let's not confuse ourselves. African women who are wives and mothers, they're contributing to development. There's not one maybe one, but there's not many African women in Ghana, in Nigeria, or other spaces that don't have jobs, that don't have shops, that don't, that aren't doing multiple ways, entrepreneur, so-called small businesses or entrepreneur type material, type jobs to help supplement their family, to put their children through school. And so even when we think about the contributions of African women, we tend to box it into this domestic sphere, but we forget that alongside this domestic sphere, African women are holding the economy down, right, on a daily basis. You drive anywhere in Accra and you see women hawking everything. And those same women are cooking for their families. Those same women are paying their children's school fees. Those same women are developing and contributing to society. But because society says that humanity is dictated based on you being a mother and wife, we all aspire to be mothers and wives and forget about the other contributions that we're making in society. So I don't know if that makes my point make any more sense or less abstract. Thank you.
I think it clarifies a lot. And I wanted to just jump in and give Sister Zandiswa an opportunity because when we think about, if we just have liberation, we will be able to secure the rights of all people, secure the rights of women, et cetera. And so we're supposed to see South Africa as a free South Africa. We have an ANC-dominated government. And so Zandiswa, maybe just, briefly talk about how do we change the dynamics in Azania, South Africa, when it is supposed to be a free South Africa? And if not, what is it that women must do to change the dynamic and begin to occupy spaces of power?
Thanks, Alison Zuri, for that question. When I think in relation to our context, right, when Sister Mjiba was just speaking about ideology, right, and the need to reorientate in relation to our ideological framework and also what we think of ourselves as women, right, but also what does society say in relation to us, right? And I think that when you look at ideology, you need to be able to understand that there's contestation of ideologies all the time, right? So there is the battle between your revolutionary forces, right, or your revolutionary makeup in relation to a leftist ideology, and also there is the pro-capitalist ideological setup, which very much so in our context bends in between your neo-colonial and your colonial setup, right? So for example, the existence of the African National Congress in our context is simply a continuation of a colonial or neo-colonial political framework, right? Now, when you look at that, is that the ideology that is currently the political power in political party in power, right? And they are the ones in actual fact that determine ideological dynamics within or the populist view in terms of ideology, right? So you find that your leftist bloc or your revolutionary forces in the actual fact, they are strongly weakened. If you look at the nature of the liberation struggle from the continuation of transformation and also integration into the now so-called Rainbow Nation, Free South Africa, right? You find that there has been a process and a deliberate depoliticization program, right? Where even women that participated within the struggle, when you look at their political or ideological makeup, you question even why were they even struggling even to begin with, right? Because you believe that these are people that should be able to understand what the primary contradictions were then and what the primary contradictions are today in our context. So what you'll find is that we'll have women leagues, right? Or organizations which are trying to organize women at a political level. And this is to be able to also allow for spaces or access to your economic and social change, right? Or transformation in relation to the question or the existence of or the struggles of women. So you'll find that there'll be a lot of women that will organize politically, but then what governs the nature and the order of that organization is their ideological framework and makeup. This is obviously on the part of the neo-colonial and colonial part of it. And then when you look at our politics, right, your leftist revolutionary politics, right, you'll find that there's a small number of women who are now trying to organize, right? But then what happens is that the question of disorganization from our side, and also the part where the left is weak, right? And that also filters into how, for example, are we able to organize women within our society, but also the factors that do not allow us from being able to organize ourselves to a place or to a stage where we are able to have access to spaces, but also through that access to spaces, we then are able to determine the dynamics, for instance, within that makeup. I'll just make a very, very short example. So for example, if you say within our bloc, right, or your leftist politics, if you say that it is very important and revolution necessitates that women become part of the front line of our struggles, merely because we are many, and also because we are the most oppressed within society, right? And also because we transform even the politics of liberation on its own, right? Because of our makeup, but also because our women. So what you find is why it becomes important for, right? So they'll say that, no, well, in terms of being part of the leadership pool, but also very much so, even the women that do get to make it into those spaces, they do not become a representation of the majority of women who are oppressed within our society, and them being able, in actual fact, to channel and contest the status and the humanity of women in relation to the liberation struggle. So our problem is that the contending ideology, right, or you could put it as the popular ideological view, and the strength or the weaknesses of the left in relation to organizing and also galvanizing and mobilizing society in relation to the matters that we deal with on a daily basis, and how we are restructuring and trying to do that. That also becomes a component to not being able to weaken your right-wing politics, right? Or your neo-colonialist setup. So another example is the pandemic. Now, obviously, we understand that women are already oppressed as things are. Now, when there is another layer in relation to chaos or instigated chaos like that of coronavirus and the pandemic, you know that the people in actual fact who are going to suffer even more are women and children. Even when you are speaking in relation to war, right? The people that suffer in most cases are women and children. So for example, when a government, for example, in our situation, calls for a total lockdown, disregarding the reality that women have to be people that go out into the streets and work to be able to feed their families. They can't be able to go to shops, right? Even the question of the educational access to education, right? In the sense that when you close down everything, women themselves, in actual fact, when you look at how are they going to study in a makeup of a normal family setup with the pressures that they are already dealing with. For example, if I have to be submitting an assignment and I still have to deal with the fact that I need to be able to feed my family, but also at the very same time, I need to be able to take care of everyone else within the family setup. How does that, for example, not assist my process of being able to further education, or at least be contending within the space of your educational setup? But I'm basically saying that when a lockdown or hard lockdown is declared in a country where you know that women have to be up and down, right? Trying to make means, trying to deal with the questions or the problems of society, and also the fact that they need to deal with the violation of their bodies within these very makeups in relation to these families, right? So domestic violence, rape, and all of these other contradictions that we have to deal with within our households and also within our communities, where community members participate within these actions. But also the very fact that the very people who display this nature of practice, they simply just filtered that down simply from a system that has taught them to be violent, right? And they don't understand any other language outside violence. And also they play out the frustrations that they have with capitalism in relation to your family or social dynamics. So the consideration of the lives, right? And the nature of existence of women, because we are very weak in terms of organizing, not because we can't organize, not because we haven't organized and put together change that is clear, right? Or forced, for example, the state to reconsider certain things. But it's simply because we are not organizing and mobilizing strategically as the left in relation to empowering women and also allowing women to be able to be at the front line of the struggle, to forward, like to forward the struggle of women in our society, and also helping women within our society understand, for example, that the face of struggle and the face of revolution looks just like them, right? It is no superhero that comes nowhere else outside them as normal people who are exploited and oppressed, looking for solutions in relation to their problems. So I want to take that problem back to, yeah, obviously, your right, politics will continue with their program. But what do we do in relation to that, right? How do we strengthen the left, and also how do we strategically organize in relation to where our people are at, and also extending and also heightening their consciousness to a level of we are no longer protesting on the streets and burning tires, or even, for example, working with boards that said that not me, right? Or will I be next, right? But deliberate action that is able, for example, to transcend our politics from the normal things that we deal with to a place where it becomes about revolution and also about the reorientation, in actual fact, of the struggle itself. So I don't know if that answers your question holistically, Alison Zuri, but I think that it does reflect in relation to what is it that we are dealing with, not just in South Africa, I think, but I think in the continent, and I think in the diaspora as well, but in different dynamics, or it plays out in different dynamics.
Yes, thank you, Sister Zandiswa Nkosi. I want to, I think some of the main points is that we must organize as women. We must organize in every space. We have to organize our own security. We have to organize our own place in the economy. We have to organize our own spaces so that we can begin to occupy those spaces. So I think those were very, very good points and examples. As I put in the chat, we have time to entertain one or two questions or comments, and if you could make them very brief. We want to also invite you, if you are in a Pan-Africanist organization and are doing this kind of work and you want to join this campaign, please put your information in the chat. We want to reach out to you and we want to include you as a part of this campaign that we're doing to further expand it. We also want to remind you, this is African Liberation Month, and the All African People's Revolutionary Party is organizing events on the 24th and on the 25th. There's the flyer. If you go to our APRP Facebook page, you'll find it. You'll find it on Instagram and Twitter as well. So please join us on the 24th and 25th for these events for African Liberation Day. And there are also events that are happening around the diaspora that you will find on our page that we will share with you that are being organized by other organizations. So we want to thank you in advance for your work and your support of building Pan-Africanism, which we say is the total liberation and unification of Africa and all her peoples under scientific socialism. So do we have one or two questions that we can address from the audience, and then we'll prepare to close?
There were a couple of questions that were in the chat. However, if that has not been entertained, some of the responses were in the chat as well. Because let me go from the beginning. How do young women reclaim our power in communities that are still following judgmental rules towards women that are archaic? And that came from Sister Anumaat. And then we also had a comment question regarding that economic empowerment should be the focus for us as the forerunners of this battle. There was an inquiry, how can the AU, CARICOM support our work on this? And in the responses, and I want to thank Comrade Njiba for really clarifying the piece about economic empowerment as important, and that the challenge is to really address it through the lens of the dismantling of the capitalist imperialist model and the integration of a more progressive, less oppressive, less repressive form as well. And so I was really appreciative of that. There were some.
I see one question here that is a comment question. I see what I see is fear of our women who, what can we do to remove or reverse that and put this in possession? And I think, that's a very good question. And it speaks to not only what everyone has said, but if the dominant culture says this is who we are and this is what our role is and this is what we're supposed to accept as women, how do we push back against that? And if one or two of you would answer that, because I don't want to dominate the discussion, but if one or two of you want to answer that question, how do we remove or reverse this fear? And I know it's ideological and
Mhm.
political, but I know for us in the APRP and the AWRU, the political education piece, having these discussions with ourselves and with our sisters on a regular basis, doing study and interaction, taking this discussion into the community and doing programs where we engage with other sisters and have this discussion and giving them a voice to discuss and explain and providing an audience and doing this kind of regular interaction. I have seen through years of doing Pan-African Women's Day and having a sister speaks, and it's like whoever you are, you can get on the mic and just say what, and just really encouraging each other and studying and engaging. I've seen a transformation over the years, and I know it in my community. But anyone else have any input on this question?
Auntie, I'm sorry, can I come in?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think I agree with everything that you said. I think it's about, transforming our ideology, but I also think it's about creating safe spaces. And nowadays, this thing about safe spaces, everyone's talking about a safe space, but I think creating spaces in which African women can engage, critically discuss, and strategize, right, about how to collectively push back against this fear and against this repression. And it has happened, right? So for example, during the most recent Liberian Civil War, there was and there's a movie about this, there was the two political entities that were struggling or fighting, they came to Accra to have negotiations, and they were, stalemated and whatnot. And so Liberian women came from around the region and sat outside the convention center and wouldn't let them leave until they came to a resolution. And in the video, men are trying to jump out the window, and women are being alerted that they're jumping out the window, and they're running around the corner and pushing them back in and saying, you need to, and they literally had no choice. I think they held them hostage for about 48 hours or several days, and they came to a resolution. And so what I'm saying is that, I'm saying that to say that women need to have spaces in which they can organize the power in which that we possess, that's already there. And also I think one of our challenges is that many women are organizing individually in different spaces, because the contemporary organizations that we have, there's high levels of patriarchy, right? The patriarchal institutions run women away. And so we have to figure out ways to create spaces inside of those institutions, like the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, for example, that can encourage women to exercise their power. And then lastly, I know this was longer than I thought it would be, but unfortunately in some spaces, women, the way in which Pan-African institutions often organize, I don't want to say it's out of line, but I think it's out of sync with the way women organize in a contemporary space, right? And also doesn't necessarily address our day-to-day needs. And so I think pushing back on some of those organizational strategies will also help recruit more women and have more women in spaces where they feel they can be free to express their ideas. And then once that happens, then they go into their, outside of the organization, and they push back collectively against some of these things. I don't know if it makes sense. Thanks a lot. Forward ever.
It makes a lot of sense. Any other comments from the panel before we close, because we're a bit over time now. Right. And I do want to, as I said, invite other organizations, Pan-Africanist organizations, because we can expand this and perhaps come up with, collective solutions and begin to work together to expand this campaign and to engage more women around the globe, more African women around the globe, and be able to do things in our communities and villages and support those things in whatever ways we can. So just please, if you're in an organization, if you're a part of an organization, then please give us that information, a Pan-Africanist organization. And if you're not, please go to our APRP page and sign up to join if you're interested in joining a Pan-African organization and in joining this discussion and expanding the work that we're trying to do. Last comments?
I just wanted to share that there were a number of things that we said today that some persons might have thought we were only speaking from a space of discussion and more discussion, and that everything that's being shared herein is linked to organizational, practical, on the ground, grassroots, and everything in between, activities, programs, events, initiatives, and institution building. And that's why the question keeps being raised. If you are part of a Pan-Africanist organization and you are in a space to support this particular movement, to really facilitate times where we can discuss, but the discussion is grounded on what we're gonna do or what we're able to do or what we're actually building. It's very important that persons do not leave from this circle today thinking that it's just for us to have like another seminar, another webinar. While those are very important for us to bring up these points, the intention is so that we can tie it directly to organizing on the ground, where you're at, what you're doing, how you build. Are we helping sisters to be able to have shelter, clothing, security, of course, and transport and food so that they can be involved in this organizational work? So, and I say that with the caveat that there are several sisters here. We can actually go through all the names, and I'm very grateful for the participants that are inside of the Zoom space. And I'm very grateful for those that are viewing, whether they're viewing on Facebook, where we're live streaming, or on YouTube, where we're live streaming, so that we can move this discussion into a very practical spacing so that we're able to handle that food, clothing, shelter, security space, because that's really one of the critical, those are some of the critical areas where the fear kicks in, where the possession overload kicks in, where that oppressiveness slips in. And that that goes beyond only intellectual, philosophical, ideological, economic spaces. We're talking about our essence of our humanity as African women. It has been challenged, it has been terrorized. I don't even just say interfered with. This is terrorism. This is an intentional, institutional, forceful talons on our back, and it has to be released. It needs to be dissipated. So I'm hoping that persons that are hearing this discourse and are looking at different portions of what we've shared, which could easily be very detailed and more lengthy, bring the organizations that are Pan-African, that are willing to be a part of this entire movement. It is essential, it is critical. And we're very much so looking forward to how we can bring some of these different elements of the practicality, what you're doing in your respective community, what's going on in other parts of, in Africa, of course, as well as throughout the global spaces where African women are being impacted by all of the issues that we've talked about, because then we can truly heal and we can truly revolutionize and restore ourselves to our respectful places of dignity, power, sovereignty, and much more. Give thanks.
Give thanks. I also want to thank the comrade brothers, the allies that are here with us, supporting us, and even those that are not here, because we want to encourage our allies, our brothers, to begin to talk about these same issues amongst each other, as well as other sisters, because again, the objective is to transform the entire society. And we're talking about occupying the space of power so that we can educate, train, develop and expand the entire society, because everyone is facing forms of violence and subjugation and exploitation. Everyone is experiencing homelessness and houselessness and, not having food, clothing and shelter. And so we're talking about transforming, revolutionizing and transforming our society wherever we are. So to be a part of this, we want to give you a recognition and thank you for that as well. So in closing, we want to thank you all for participating, for sharing. If there are no other questions or comments, I think we have read a few in the chat. We will be following up with a part 3, where we're going to go into a deeper dive into our next area and have this discussion, and maybe we'll have it a little longer so we can have more engagement. And again, we encourage you to create an organization, join an organization that already exists that in your area that is working towards the revolutionary transformation of our society, the liberation of Africa, and the unity of African people. And unity is not just talk. Unity is not just a phrase or a catchphrase or a t-shirt. Unity is really the work of respecting and uplifting all of us in the society. And we really want to further clarify that point, because we know that people have been using it as a catchphrase, but we wouldn't be having this discussion today if we weren't absent that kind of unity that we really need to have, even within our own organizations. So we say, help us expand this, to lift up and raise up the level of our social, political, and ideological and philosophical societies by better organizing ourselves as women, as all gender of humanity. And let us continue to go forward ever, backwards never, remain ready for the revolution. Thank you.
Ready for revolution.
Forward ever.
Backwards never.